fresh hour of Green Mountain Mornings here on 100.3 FM, AM 1490. I am your host, Olga Peters, just about 10 minutes past the top of the hour, and I want to welcome via the technology of telephones, Chris Mays from The Reformer. Hey there, Chris.
Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, I'm sorry I couldn't be in the studio this morning.
We will miss you, and by we, I mean BCTV and I. BCTV is here filming this segment of Green Mountain Mornings, and broadcast of Green Mountain Mornings tonight on BCTV is sponsored by Brattleboro Savings and Loan. So see, Chris, you are missing a party in the studio.
I know.
Will you be going to the select board meeting tonight?
Yes, I will be there.
You sound determined.
Yeah. Well, I'm just looking at the agenda right now, and it looks like a pretty interesting meeting. A lot of decisions to be made, or at the very least, discussions.
I agree. I have a feeling, because there's a few issues. One that are kind of meaty, like the public works feasibility study. I think that sounds like just a really meaty issue. But then I suspect the dangerous dog appeal and the Southeastern Vermont economic development strategies, people tend to have very strong opinions about both those issues.
Yeah, and I see the recommendation is to fund SEVID's efforts at $3 per person, which hasn't really been going through in the past few years, but has still been the recommendation. So it'll be interesting to see if there is how the board recommends it to town meeting in March. Right.
Now, remind me. You're right. In the past, the board has recommended more along the lines of like $2 a person, just in very broad strokes. Do you remember what the board's rationale behind that is?
I think a lot of it had to do with the economic development efforts the town itself does. They give out loans and grants and really engage with the business community. So they felt like they were kind of doing a big part in the community. And I think it might also have to do with the town hosting a lot of the bigger employers in the area, and that leading to the town needing to spend more on infrastructure needs.
Okay. That's interesting. Thank you for that reminder. And I'm guessing that those arguments will remain the same.
Yeah, I don't know if that will change. It'll be interesting to hear. I think, SEVIDS always recommends, a certain number based on the population, and that's, all over Windham County. So they don't really change that. They don't look at each town and what they're offering to businesses or residents. They really just go down the line and have every town pay the same.
And I think that has been one of the criticism of SEVIDS from individual towns of, well, we're giving you this money. I'm not sure it's an argument that Brattleboro could make, but other towns say, well, we're giving you this money, but we never see you and we never hear from you. And what have you done economic development wise in this town?
Yeah, I think every year every year BDCC, the organization that's involved with SEVIDS, they have their staff going around, and one of the things I'm hearing at meetings I attend is, we're making it to more meetings every year before town meeting, and I think they really feel like they're engaging with local select boards and the public at these meetings more and more each year, so there's a better understanding of what they do.
Well, and to be fair, a lot of things with economic development aren't necessarily seen. And so SEVIDS can be doing a number of regional initiatives that are helping float all boats, but maybe we just don't see them on a daily basis.
Yeah, and sometimes, we hear when there's a big breakthrough, when BDCC helps a business stay in the region, or if they find another big employer to take the place of another, or just, a big type of deal like that. And then we hear about it, but it might be one day of news and then it's on to the next thing. So sometimes we might not fully appreciate all the behind the scenes work that's going on.
Yep. And to just play devil's advocate, so I was being fair before, now I'm playing devil's advocate.
Sure.
CEVEDS is not always very good, or BDCC is not always very good at sharing some of the behind the scenes information.
Yeah, I guess sometimes it can, sometimes they're, they've got to balance what they're doing. There's lawyers involved, and they got to protect the businesses they're working with. But yeah, I think overall there's been this push to be really transparent with the public, and so people can see what they're doing with some of these taxpayer funds.
Yes, and that is something we can't forget, is even though they are a private nonprofit, they do use a fair amount of taxpayer funds, which is kind of why we're even having this conversation.
Yeah.
Before we go to break, Chris, I want to check in quickly. What are your thoughts on the feasibility study for the Public Works building on Fairground Road?
Well, I'm hoping to learn more about it tonight, but it seems like they're taking the right steps toward seeing what should and can be done there. I'm really interested in hearing from the town attorney and his suggestions on the proposed vehicles for hire. Expanding the taxi cab ordinance.
Yeah,
and I know part of it is coming more into line with the federal regulations and not making it so burdensome on people who are applying for these permits.
That was a good point that was brought up at the last discussion around the taxi cab ordinance, was that some companies are already reaching some federal requirements, and so why do they have to duplicate efforts? Basically was the question that came from some of the companies.
Yeah, and I scanned through some of the correspondence from the town attorney, and he's really recommending that the town not make people duplicate such efforts.
We are back, and this is Green Mountain Mornings on 100.3 FM, AM 1490. I am your host, Olga Peters, and my guest for this hour is Chris Mays from The Reformer. Welcome back, Chris.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for being here.
Yeah.
We were talking about tonight's select board meeting at the top of the hour. I want to go back to the Brattleboro Select Board and talk about a decision they made at their previous meeting, which was to put the 1% local option tax for the 7th time back before representative town meeting. So it will be on the warning in March. Chris, what are your thoughts on this?
It's really interesting for me to watch, just because my experience with this tax revenue in the past has been with Dover and Wilmington, and they were really, they were very conscious of the fact that they were making business owners put this extra tax on customers. So those funds are going toward economic development programs and projects. And I mean, that has its own, issues and arguments. But in Brattleboro, it's interesting because they're just talking about putting it, offsetting whatever the property tax is going to be. It's just, additional revenue to the town.
Right. And I think when Peter Elwell, the town manager, was on the show last week, he talked about that a little bit. One thing Brattleboro has, a shift that Brattleboro has had in its grand list over many, many decades, is the shift of commercial property, slowly the tax rate falling more and more on residential property. And so he's
Yeah.
kind of looking at this tax as, I don't quite want to say taking up slack for the business property, but kind of. I mean, it's a tax relief measure more than anything.
Yeah, and I know Tim Wessel, who's been pretty much the most outspoken proponent of this tax, has been saying how it could be a way to attract people who are kind of on the fence about living in Brattleboro. They're seeing the tax rates go up. They're seeing outlying communities' tax rates staying more stable or on the lower end. So he looks at this as a way to perhaps bring more people to live in town, and that would have the benefit of having more people to essentially tax and share the burden.
Mm-hmm. What do you think? Do you think that would be a knock-on effect?
I've heard both sides. Some people think that we don't need to be taxed any more than we already are.
Mm-hmm.
We don't need this extra tax on our goods.
Right.
But then there's the other side, saying, hey, it's only this little bit of it's a 1% increase. Most people aren't even going to really feel it or notice it. So it's going to be very interesting to hear everyone talk about it at the informational meeting and before, at town meeting. And, David Scholes, he suggested if people want to chime in, that they can come to select board meetings and talk during public comment. So I'll be listening to, what the community has to say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's, the argument I hear, and of course I had Randy Holhut from the Commons on the show Friday, and we talked about this as well. His biggest concern is that being next to New Hampshire, it will be one more excuse for people to go to New Hampshire. I'm not quite sure about that. I think when people decide to shop outside their local community, there's a lot that goes into that. Everything from the tax rate or no tax rate to, I tend to, when I take my mom shopping, she spends most of her time in a wheelchair. So Keene is where we go because that's where she can access the stores most easily. That doesn't have to do with tax rate. That's not the decision we're making. So I'm not sure.
Yeah,
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'm not sure that 1% will drive new people to Keene. If they're already shopping there, they're already shopping there.
Yeah. From my personal experience, I go to the record shops downtown and the music shop. I pick up guitar strings and music books, and you develop this camaraderie with the people in the shop, and it's in the shops, and it's just that's a reason why I go to those shops. It's one of the reasons, besides just having what I need and being close and being within the community. So I'm sure some people will say, "Oh, the hell with this," and I'm going to New Hampshire, but I don't know if that's going to be the majority.
Yeah. Excuse me, I agree with you. I think the bigger issue, and I brought this up with Randy, is I think in general we just have a level of exhaustion with our local community. I think a lot of people working in this economy, whether it's within Brattleboro or the surrounding communities, we put out a lot of energy and we're not getting a lot of resources back. And so the perception of just one more fee or one more thing we have to pay out that we're not necessarily getting back in our paycheck, I think that would be the bigger issue for a lot of people than the actual what the tax is on or whether or not they'll go to Keene.
Yeah.
What are you seeing, or what's your take on that, Chris? I mean, are you hearing from people that they're just working hard and not getting much back, or is that just my experience?
I think so far what I've heard from is what I've heard about is the concern that it will have on the most vulnerable populations, the homeless, the the people who make less, and how that's just, more and more that they'll have to pay out of their pockets that they don't necessarily have. And, it's kind of easy for me to say, oh, it's just 1% more, and it won't be that bad. And if it's going to help the town, then, it's not a big deal to me. But, I shouldn't lose sight of who it could affect.
Mm-hmm. That's a very good point. Thank you, Chris. Thanks for joining us here on Green Mountain Mornings on 100.3 FM, AM 1490. I am your host, Olga Peters. It is 37 minutes past the top of the hour, and welcome Chris Mays to the show. Thanks for hanging out with us this morning.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Tell me, you recently covered the budget in the West River Valley School District. Tell us what's kind of the highlights there.
Well, it was an interesting night because it was Monday night when they had the big storm.
Oh, yeah.
So people knew that they were sitting there and they were going to have a long ride home, or at least a scary one, because the roads weren't too good. So, but it was really interesting because the majority of districts in the Wyndham Central Supervisory Union have now merged into the West River Modified Union School District. Mm-hmm. And so now they had the administration, the Wyndham Central administration, propose a budget to the board. And, this was the board's first look at what's recommended. And what they're seeing is this 10% bump when you combine all the school budgets together. And it's not something they had anticipated, but they talked about where the increases were coming from, and it was in salaries, benefits, food services. That's noteworthy. It's a $50,000 increase in food services because now they're going to offer universal meals at all the schools.
Wow! And
then, yeah. And then one of the other ones is $732,000 in building operations, and that's to take care of some deferred maintenance and other projects that have come up. And so there's a building committee, and the members are going to talk about maybe cutting that down a little bit and see what really needs to be done this year versus what can maybe wait another year. Mm-hmm. There's a failing boiler at Leland and Gray, which they're trying to get a grant to help offset the cost of replacing. But yeah, that's a big chunk of money.
Now, what was the board's reaction? I would think that seeing a 10% increase in a school budget would be very nerve-wracking for a board, but did they feel that this was acceptable, or that these increases, such as investing in universal meals, was a good investment?
Yeah, there was no question at all about the universal meals. Some people in the audience might have been questioning it a little bit, saying maybe we could put our money somewhere else. But for the most part, the board didn't really have anything to say about that because that was part of an earlier decision. Uh-huh. I think there was $265,000 in assessments for special education and early education. So that was something where they're saying, hey, we can't do anything about this number. Same thing really with the salaries and benefits. These teachers and professionals are all on contracts, and so there's not a lot of leeway. They cut almost one full-time equivalent position with all the different rearranging and getting the sixth grade at Leland and Gray. Mm-hmm. But I think there's just not a lot of wiggle room right now. And I think the one thing that they're looking at is that building maintenance. So they might be able to cut some of that down.
And is the board feeling right now, or maybe this is something you're seeing covering the West River Valley District, does it feel like Act 46 for this district is working, or Are there challenges? What's kind of the feeling there?
Well, I think some people are definitely saying, you know, they might have been thinking, hey, we're going to see some cost savings here. That's something that's sort of been walked back as Act 46 has sort of played out.
Yeah.
But in terms of finding efficiencies, that was one of the goals that I heard early on, and I think that's going to happen because now there's one budget and a big room of people, a big number of people in one room talking about it. So someone who might not be at the Townsend Elementary School Board meeting will now be at this big board meeting, and they'll be in the room talking to each other and bouncing ideas off of each other. And it's really incredible to see. I mean, I was talking about this with you before. As a reporter, it was largely about talking about who opposed the merger, who was for the merger,
yeah.
The community divisions that this law created. But now watching this board, it's sort of nice to see, all the teachers or the principals rather, that there were some teachers there talking about specific programming, but the principals in the same room with the administration, with the school board, and then a large number of community members on a big during a big storm gathered together talking about education.
Mm-hmm. Well, go ahead, Chris. Sorry.
Sometimes it gets really passionate, and there was people's voices were growing louder and louder, and people are still upset about the sixth grade move. But what the superintendent says is these are people who are passionate about their kids and the education of the community's kids, and so this is just a bump in the road.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm so glad you shared that with us, Chris, because I have been working on an article for the Commons with my other part-time job. And, I've been talking to people in the communities of Wyndham and also, Brattleboro, Guilford, Putney, Dummerston, who don't want to merge. And the state on Friday, or the State Board of Education, I should say, on Friday, released its final report. And it talked about the next steps for these communities across Vermont that had yet to merge. And, for these communities, Act 46 is something that so far has not worked for them, or they find flaws. And, of course, there's a lawsuit that will be filed before December 28th against the state on issues of constitutionality. So I appreciate you sharing the perspective from a community that is finding that Act 46 has had some benefits.
Yeah, I mean it's not all positive. Some people are, still say that it's not, it hasn't really been what we thought it was going to be, and some people worry about that concentrated power rather than having all the school boards in the supervisory union.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is such a tough issue because to a certain extent, that concentration of power, whether it is positive or negative, will depend on who's serving on the board and who's in leadership positions. And you could have great leaders one year and not so great leaders the next. That's a really hard thing to navigate or predict.
Yeah, and these budgets are gonna be so big, and they're gonna have so many impacts. I think you're gonna see a lot more community involvement because it's just this big board, and people will be able to get their views out.
That will be great if these mergers can help increase community involvement. I think that would be absolutely brilliant.
The only thing I worry about, though, is maybe if some people might say, "Oh, it's they've already got it covered," or it's too big for me to get involved in, because this budget at the West River Valley is $12.4 million, so a big chunk, but it's adding all those elementary schools together and the high school.
Right. Right. Yeah, just out of curiosity, give us a number of how many schools or how many school buildings are under this budget.
So you have elementary schools in Jamaica, Newfane, and Townsend.
Mm-hmm.
And Brookline students go to Newbrook, which is in Newfane, and then the Leland and Gray Union Middle and High School is in Townsend. So it's 4 school buildings altogether.
Mm-hmm. That's a lot of infrastructure to cover with one budget.
Yeah, and they just had an engineering study done, which is where that big building operations increase is coming from. There's a lot of recommendations from these engineers, and I think the administration felt we should put at least the majority of them in there so we can, see what to do.
Mm-hmm. It will be interesting to see how over the next few years, of course, depending on how the lawsuit goes or depending on what the legislature does in the upcoming session. But those aside, it will be interesting to see how Act 46 sugars off, because I think how it was initially presented and rolled out is not going to be the same as the outcomes. I think we were told up front that, Act 46 is going to save us so much money, and you'll see a drop in property taxes, and that was like the big push very early on for Act 46. And then it became about governance structure and how it will make things more efficient, but I think only time will tell what is...
And
go ahead.
Yeah, and the big thing now is talking about student equity, improving student equity across the board, statewide, and that's something that boards are definitely taking into consideration. The West River board, I know that's the big push there, and board members feel like the 6th grade move to Leland and Gray is going to achieve some of that. And, same thing with the universal lunches and expanding pre-K to have all students in the district have access to pre-K. So,
yeah, I agree, Chris. Hey, Chris, so much fun having you on the show today. I look forward to talking to you in 2 weeks.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Take care.